To get going here, basically we're gonna do this webinar in a sort of structured way. We're going to start out just by kind of framing up what this software supply chain security report is all about, kind of the methodology we used in putting this together. We're going to review some of the top level findings, and then importantly at the end, give you all suggestions on how what we found should maybe shape your thinking and strategy going into 2025 about emerging risks and how your organization can best be prepared for them. Okay, so on the methodology front, our report relies heavily on data on known vulnerabilities and CVEs, as well as other types of risks. And Tomislav, maybe I thought maybe just give the audience a little bit of an overview of the types of data that ReversingLabs compiles and tracks through its Spectra platform that kind of form the foundation of this report.
Absolutely. So it is multifaceted, but here we're talking about CVEs and vulnerabilities. That is a collection of all of the vulnerability information that is publicly available. You can think about the sources like NVD, for example, OSV data sources, and other commercial vendors and partners that collaborate with us to have a as detailed as possible data set on the vulnerabilities themselves. We do enrich this data by ourselves as well with threat intelligence to figure out who on the attacker side is using this vulnerability information, how they're using it, are there any known exploits, is there automated exploitation, is there malware, is even CISA that Chris worked for, saying that this must be patched in a government environment as well. All this information when put together is kind of presented and has very interesting findings about the relevancy of the data, how big of a backlog NVD has, and all this stuff.
And as we're going to talk about, it's important to realize, CVEs, known vulnerabilities are definitely, critical and important in terms of our assessment of security risk, but they're definitely not the whole picture for us. There's a lot of other stuff that we're looking at. We're going to talk about that. And one of the things that we do with the Spectra platform is to assess both open source and commercial software binaries against a wide range of security policies that we have, and this can be everything from, SQL injection or lack of application hardening. So there are a wide range of different things that we're using to assess risk. Tomislav, maybe just give a sense of kind of how many security policies there are, and what are some of the common ones that we are finding when we're looking at both open source and commercial code.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we're talking about 6 different categories of issues for any software package, and those are the most critical types of risks that people are worried about when installing and deploying software solutions. So you can think about, exposed secrets, for example, license compliance issues, malware embedded in the software packages, tampering of software package code, application hardening issues, and vulnerabilities as well. So these are the categories. We have about 300 different types of policies regarding these software quality issues, and we've cataloged all the software supply chain, I mean the open source aspect of it, for these various data points. So the report itself goes into the details of how often do we see secrets being leaked, for example, how prevalent are specific vulnerability types, how many packages were actually tampered with in the last year, and so on and so forth.
Excellent. And we're going to dig into, so there's some, as you analyze more and more different applications, binaries, patterns emerge, and types of problems that are common across different applications. We're going to talk about some of those, particularly with regard to commercial software. So worth noting, though, we are a big contributor to the Open Source Security Foundation's Open SSF ratings. These are a rating system for open source code. Tomislav, talk just a little bit about our contributions to that.
Absolutely. We're a big fan of what OpenSSF is doing, and we're actually contributing all of the data that I've just mentioned back to OpenSSF. There's this GitHub repository they have, it's a public one, anybody can access it, which kind of tries to catalog all of the malicious packages that were discovered uh, since the beginning of time, really. And there's thousands and thousands of different packages that were either compromised, that specific versions, or they were outright malicious as well. We've started contributing our data last year, and today we are one of the key contributors to that project.
And how can organizations use that? I mean, what function does that serve? I mean, one of the issues has always been having an objective kind of assessment of risk with open source code. Is that kind of the idea here?
Well, the idea here is if you're a software developer or just publishing software in general, as you're kind of pulling in third-party components and dependencies from open source places like npm, PyPy, RubyGems, and so on, you want to be able to assess the level of risk assigned to every single component that you're using. And OpenSSF is tracking both malicious packages that I've just mentioned, but also kind of like the best practices revolving security, uh, configurations and
Hmm.
maintainability of certain projects and so on and so forth. So when you combine all that data, you get an insight into how much does that software project cares about security, really.
Okay. Okay, and let's move ahead now to our kind of key findings here. Before we get going, I mean, I think it's probably useful to kind of frame up the software supply chain security risk problem. And Chris, this is kind of a question for you, which is we definitely have heard a lot more about software supply chain risk. Maybe the SolarWinds incident kind of brought this into the foreground for enterprises and for the infosec industry generally. Um, what is your sense about sort of the level of awareness and preparedness that enterprises or government agencies have around this particular type of threat that's coming through their open source and the commercial software that they use and services they rely on?
Yeah, I hate to use the political answer. It depends, but it does. It depends on the organization's kind of maturity and capabilities. And in terms of commercial versus government, I think in government it's particularly pronounced with we talked about federal cybersecurity executive order efforts by CISA and many other agencies, Department of Defense, et cetera. At this point, around software supply chain security, including open source and things like that. But that said, there's a big disparity, in my opinion, between awareness and readiness. Like we are aware that it's a problem, right? The reports such as this, and other reports point out that these attacks are only increasing in terms of malicious, compromise of open source packages, even targeting, commercial proprietary software vendors to get to their consumers and customers. But being able to kind of combat that and mitigate those threats. Is still a challenge, including for different federal agencies, especially kind of in this current environment where they're seeing resource constraints and restructuring and things like that cause kind of outsized challenges. So I think it really depends, and a lot of organizations, as the report shows, are continuing to consume open source at an exponential rate. But when it comes to kind of tying that with open source software governance and security and kind of taking steps to mitigate risk from open source, maybe we're not seeing a kind of a one-to-one correlation there, despite the rise in attacks. So I think a lot of organizations still have a lot of work to do, and many of them are aware of that. They're taking steps to get there, but it's going to be a process. The problem didn't kind of materialize overnight, and neither will the solutions.
Agreed. Okay, moving into some of the findings. One of the kind of big trends we saw in the last year, and it's really not just the last year, it goes back further than that, is just an increase in the level of sophistication of software supply chain attacks. And one of the things that we saw, and other companies, was a focus on organizations, whether those are software producers or infrastructure providers, with ties to the cryptocurrency industry, and just I think we had more than 24 attacks just in 2024 that were supply chain attacks targeting crypto. And this graphic just breaks down when we looked at it, you know, what platform was used for it. Chris, I'll go back to you. Is this sort of the Willie Horton, you know, you rob banks because that's where the money is phenomena playing out here? Or why crypto? Why is crypto such a target?
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. Is, you know, you look at the incentives, and we're seeing these organized, you know, cyber criminal groups start to mature. Obviously, they run themselves much like a business, looking to make profits, you know, avoid losses, you know, drive up revenue, I guess you would call it in their world. So it makes sense that crypto is a target. It's the same reason that we see, you know, ransomware such a you know, kind of a highly enticing area of cybersecurity, because you can get financial compensation, right, from the victims. So
Right.
you're tying it to a financial benefit where, you know, it's not necessarily just a nation state versus a nation state, or, you know, something like that. There's a financial motive involved. At least that, you know, that's kind of my read of the situation.
Could we infer from this that there are structural problems or quality problems generally in crypto versus other industries? Or again, no, it's just kind of trying to get to the wallets and trying to get your hands on the
Yeah,
assets.
I mean, I think it's there may be some aspect of that to that, but I think the problems that are there are kind of pervasive across other areas of the software ecosystem and open source community. It's just that, again, it's more enticing to focus on them in this particular niche because it is tied to money and, you know, financial aspects of it. So I think that's kind of what's driving it. The problems that they're there, you know, in terms of immature open source, you know, security and governance, and like you guys talked about the OpenSSF scorecard, you can look across different industries and you'll see, you know, similar results. Basically, it's not isolated to crypto.
Right. And Tomislav, in terms of the sophistication of these attacks, and in fact, we just published this week, Lucia Vantek, one of our researchers, published some research on some new NPM packages she discovered that also seem to be targeting the crypto. What are you seeing, or what jumped out at you in terms of some of the varying methodologies that are being used that we saw in some of these crypto attacks that organizations should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I guess the big takeaway for me from last year was just the increase in sophistication of these attacks. It's not necessarily so much about the number of attacks, it's what kind of techniques are being employed by the attackers to kind of gain access, to compromise, to steal funds.
Mhm.
December in particularly stood out to me as this month where quite a few popular open source packages dealing with cryptocurrency as well have been compromised through like stolen tokens, and then malicious packages were released as well. And as Paul was just saying, just this week we had another incident, and this was a very interesting one because it's a first. There was a malicious npm package that we've just discovered that is now starting to act like a virus in a traditional sense, infecting other packages that are installed on the machine itself. So this kind of opens up a whole new can of worms for software supply chain security, because this is the first instance of that happening. And if you think about it historically, software supply chain is kind of evolving at the same pace as traditional threats as well. Some of the same methods we are used to, and Chris was saying, like ransomware as well, it is also a part of the software supply chain security. We found like a VS Code extension, which was kind of like a proof of concept ransomware in development. So all of these things that the attackers know that they work, they're just gonna start doing in the software supply chain. Obviously, the primary target is the developer itself, because they want to compromise the developer, steal the credentials, and start moving laterally through the organization. But there is also an increase in attacks which are targeting the end user. So this one in particular, since the component is infected, if you were to build an application which contains an infected component, it too will become infected. And the
Mhm.
way it is infected, it's effectively a backdoor. It's a reverse shell. So anybody using these packages and deploying application is effectively infecting their own users too. So that's the scary part. And when we say software supply chain security, we really mean it's a chain.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, do um, do what do we think is, you know, I mean, we again, we're focusing on crypto, but I mean, what strikes me, and you kind of alluded to this, is there isn't necessarily a whole new type of attack or going on here. Like, in many ways, the types of attacks and the methodologies we're seeing play out in attacks on crypto organizations, pretty similar to what we've seen historically in terms of the methodology that they're using. It's just sort of what they're targeting that is different, right? Rather than deployed applications, it's the development organizations that create those applications, right? What explains that shift, I guess? Why suddenly target supply chain? Is it just because there's less monitoring of those resources, and or what? How can we understand this shift that's gone on?
Well, to me, it's just lack of visibility, really, right? Traditionally, if you think about, the development, they're kind of left alone, really. Like, they know how to build software. We're going to buy them a bunch of tools, and they're going to build this solution. And traditionally, you don't even deploy security solutions on developer desktops because, there's a bunch of false alarms as the code's being compiled, antiviruses fire off and all these things. And that, creates a visibility gap. And you kind of start living with this and think that's fine. But because there is a gap, and, suddenly attackers learn that, they start to exploit that gap. And now you have a whole problem of software supply chain security problems, because the way to build software is ever more complex. There's all sorts of dependencies you need. There's the ways you compile the software. There's the ways you deploy it, and so on and so forth. So
Right.
it's so complex. It's relatively easy to hide.
Right. So one of the things that we did in this year's report, it's a little bit different than we've done in past years, is to focus on what we refer to as commercial binaries. These are, I think of them as closed source, proprietary code, not merely open source, and look at a subset of those applications to assess whether security risks lurk in those, as well as in the open source packages that obviously we've been monitoring for a long time. So that's part of this year's report. And again, if you haven't downloaded and checked it out, you definitely should. What we found was really interesting, and what we talked about is sort of this 7 deadly sins of commercial software. These were just recurring problems or issues we saw with many of the, I think it was 30 commercial software binaries that we looked at. Chris, and those include, this is run down, the malware, evidence tampering, obviously exploitable vulnerabilities, absence of application hardening practices, the presence of leaked developer secrets, licensing issues, and SBOM, not really a sin, but lack of a detailed SBOM. Chris, interested in your thoughts when you look at these 7 deadly sins. These seem pretty familiar to you, or
Yeah, they do.
Not many surprises.
Yeah, they do. And I was honestly very excited to see this in the report. I'll admit, like a lot of software supply chain, kind of reports, research, and companies like you all, there tends to be, and rightfully so in some way. We talk about open source and the risk there, a hyper focus on the open source aspect. But if you look at like the major incidents over the last, say 12, 24 months, many of them have been tied to commercial software companies, proprietary software companies, who still have many of the fundamental challenges that the open source projects have that you just kind of enumerated, whether it's malware, vulnerabilities, things like that. Of course, there was the big early push and still interest around SBOM to provide, consumers and customers transparency of what's in the product. But that has, had some kind of fits and starts and challenges around SBOM formats and, trading that, exchanging that information and, conveying it to customers at scale. So I think the commercial binary aspect that you all highlighted in the report demonstrates that, there are other methods, right, to kind of get to this information around the commercial software you're using and the risks associated with it in the absence of an SBOM in some cases, for example. And what also struck me was, you guys you point out that a common culprit or victim, I should say, of these kind of malicious activities was VPN clients. Which is ironic, right? Because we think about security tools, and a lot of times, I'm not going to name any names, but there were several, kind of VPN client-based security companies in 2024 that had highly visible, impactful security incidents, including impacting U.S. federal agencies. So it's almost like our security tools in some cases are making us insecure or less secure. They're definitely a target for malicious actors because they have administrative access. They're often accessing sensitive data. We tend to trust our security tools. But the report showed that, well, maybe you shouldn't be, or maybe you should be doing some verification, right? In addition to that trust, again, into the vein of zero trust that we hear so much about, right? So I was actually glad to see this in there. I think it's, not that we shouldn't be concerned with open source, and open source obviously is predominantly driving much of these products. 70% of the code is often open source, that kind of thing. But yeah, the commercial software most certainly presents risks, and we need to keep that in mind.
Tomislav, the top two here, malware and tampering. That's obviously what we think about when SolarWinds or 3CX. We'll talk about the JAVS software in a second. Are these common findings? We looked at a very small subset of commercial binaries, but in the work that RL does, how common is it to find evidence of either just malware or suspicious changes that seem to be tampering?
Well, luckily, malware is not yet all that common. There are, incidents, and they, hit the news, and like even in the VPN segment that we were just talking about, there was a big incident last year in South Korea with a VPN client being Trojanized. So like anybody can get hit by a software supply chain attack. It's not that uncommon. Does it roll up into the production? That's the other bit, right? For now, at least, there is a multitude more of open source threats and attacks than it is on the commercial side. However, as we start looking at commercial software with much more scrutiny, we will be finding these things at an increased rate, and this could be the year where we start reminiscent of the SolarWinds incident and 3CX and so on. There were a couple of commercial software compromises last year, and we covered most of them in our report. However, tampering is actually much more common. Tampering can be all sorts of things, from like malicious tampering, injecting malicious code like it happened with SolarWinds, but also like just file integrity being broken, and without knowing exactly why the digital signature has been tampered with, you have to assume malicious intent. That is super common. Luckily, right now, as we're kind of investigating these things, majority of those are just accidental, meaning a developer has forgot about a flag or a feature, and the file accidentally got corrupted. But they are a big strain on a security organization, because there's now an alarm which says, oh, you have a tampered binary, and now you have to figure out, okay, so which part was tampered with, how it was tampered with, is it just a simple bit flip? And for an end user of the software, that's almost impossible to do. You have to be like a threat analyst or a reverse engineer. You have to have access to the previous versions of this software to know exactly in the differential analysis what changed and so on and so forth. So it's non-trivial. And as most users are now starting to look for ways to analyze commercial software, they will be finding these issues, and those issues will be escalated to their vendors, who, in our experience, they're not fully aware of the severity of the number of these things which is present in the software packages that they ship to their customers.
And we talk about hardening, and certainly you often see in Spectra reports, that an absence of adequate application hardening is an issue that gets flagged. What are we talking about when we talk about application hardening, Tomislav? Like, what types of development strategies are missing there?
Well, the way I like to think about it, it's the lessons from the 90s. In the good old days, you could easily, make like a buffer overflow or something, and then exploit an application, and that was very rampant because there defensive mechanisms. There were no tools to scan for software weaknesses, and also the operating system wasn't really hardened to kind of deal with these memory corruption issues. Now, as the software tool chains have matured, it became available that you can just add a compile flag, and even if you had like a bug or something, it might not always be critical. It became the bar to exploit an issue became higher, and it is good practice to have all of the available hardening options enabled if you're kind of compiling your native code like your C and C++. It is very easy to make a mistake in those types of languages, and hardening makes it harder for those bugs to become exploits, really. So when you see a lack of hardening, that means that there's also a lack of maturity of the software development organization. And sadly, in our experience, some of those developers are intentionally even disabling some of the options that are now enabled by default because some of their code won't compile and they start getting bugs. So that's very rampant. And if we, put our, consumer hats on and say, like, I want you to be secure. I want you to have all these options enabled. That's kind of like a baseline of things that you should expect when you're buying a software, really.
And Chris, I mean, I think one of the things, just the VPN stuff, I think one of the lessons there is this sort of somewhat sort of destabilizing effect of some of these findings, which is, you might assume that the security software you're buying is, these are hardened and secure applications because they're performing a security function, and they're coming from cybersecurity vendors. And yet, that might be an incorrect assumption to make, that not that they're uniquely insecure, but they might be no more secure than the non-security related applications you're using.
Yeah, I think the point you made there is perfect. It's not that they're inherently less secure. They're just an organization that produces software like anybody else, and they have the same competing internal interests like speed to market and revenue and cost savings and efficiencies and things like that. Maybe they are resource constrained internally. Maybe their internal security team can't get the engineering and development team to prioritize some of the security technical debt that needs to be addressed. These are all still organizational kind of dynamics that are at play, even if they're a security vendor. And, on one hand, I get a bit cynical here because you would think, well, they'll definitely prioritize like this because trust is everything in a security market, right? Again, not to name names, but one of the best publicly performing publicly traded security companies last year had several highly damaging, wide-reaching security incidents, and still performed incredibly well with the public market. So it's like, well, maybe investors and so on aren't particularly concerned with those kinds of incidents. They're only concerned with how the company is performing financially and returning, revenue, or not revenue, but having returns for the shareholders. So it can be a bit cynical when you think of it in that way. But again, I don't necessarily think it's intentional in any sense. It's just they're an organization with competing, interests and priorities and things like that, like anyone else. So that's at play there, I think, internally to many of these companies.
So one of the big issues, or one of the big incidents related to commercial software compromise this year that we wrote about in our report was the hack of JAVS. That's Justice AV Audiovisual Solutions, I think, JAVS. They're a maker of kind of video recording software and hardware that's used pretty heavily in prisons, courtrooms, police departments, and so on. So they serve that part of the market. And they had one of their client applications compromised. This is a copy, this is a shot of the Spectra report on it. We didn't discover this, but we did do an analysis of the JAVS software after the fact. And as you can see, found some pretty clear evidence of malware and compromise. Tomislav, thoughts on, for the JAVS software, kind of what the lessons were there? Was this a unusual campaign, or pretty common with what we see in these types of attacks?
Well, little is publicly known about how the software actually got compromised, so we can only, do a hypothesis based on what's available. But it seems to me that the software was compromised at the distribution point, meaning that the website itself started to serve a malicious download. And there were many red flags if you are the end user of the software and you use a platform such as ours. One, it detected the malware outright without any additional rules or anything like that. The malicious file itself was pretty large and has a whole bunch of behaviors in it. Things like tampering with autorun, uh, autorun functionalities of Windows, for example, where we're part of that. One of the things we have in our platform is this feature we call differential analysis, which is a prudent thing to do if you're both, releasing software and also consuming it. So literally what you can do is just drop in a binary and diff it to the previous version and see what changed. And in the report, we have a really nice display of what changed between the non-malicious and the malicious version. So a new binary was introduced. Its name was highly suspicious. I mean, it obviously was a typo squad of the
Right.
FFmpeg binary, which is kind of used to kind of do video and stuff like that. So it was called FFmpeg, so one F more really, and that was the malicious one. All sorts of other red flags like, oh, they've changed their installer format and they're no longer using the same certificate they were using and stuff like that. So it looked completely odd. So the problem with software supply chain security, as I said, is that multiple points to insert malware. And in this case, it feels like it was at the distribution point. So even if they did everything they could to ensure that they are shipping secure code, that code could have been compromised at the distribution stage and just swapped with another binary. So when we talk about software supply chain security, we really have to talk about how we build it, how we deploy it, how we distribute it. All those parts of the software supply chain can be compromised at one stage. Fortunately for the user, the only thing they have is the final binary. That's the only thing they can actually reliably check, and it is a little bit difficult to know, what are the expected changes or whatnot. But,
Mhm.
raising your hand and saying, asking the vendor, hey, did you know about this? Like it has all these vulnerabilities, it looks malicious, it behaves differently. It is a good discussion to have because as we've learned in the last couple of years, it's so easy to get infected. And then being a little bit paranoid is actually prudent.
I
Mhm.
can imagine, just
Any,
real quick, I can
go ahead.
imagine the reaction from the vendor when you come ask that type of question, because historically they're just used to this outside in kind of questioning, where you send a questionnaire and, kind of
Exactly.
robust, expansive questionnaire that really doesn't give you any insight to their security rigor and engineering, process and so on. Where if you come along and say, hey, we noticed this seems a little, peculiar, they're gonna be like, wait, how did you identify this? And likely definitely should get their attention, I imagine.
Yeah.
That's exactly how it goes. So we have customers which are kind of end users of the software. They scan it and they use our report and say, "Oh, did you know about this?" And then the vendor comes to us as well. Could we actually scan our binary because we want to be ahead of this? And you found some interesting things, some skeletons in our closet that we didn't even know about, and we want to be transparent and we want to fix these things before the customer calls us. So
Right.
it is prudent to actually do that on both ends.
Right. Um, One of the interesting things when we hear, oh, justice AV solutions, courtrooms and stuff like that, I think everybody's mind sort of turns to the state actor type scenario, right? Like, oh, they might be the one who would be interested in that. But Tomislav, unless I'm mistaken, there were a lot of signs in our analysis that pointed actually in the direction of kind of cyber criminal groups based on the malware used and so on. Do we? I know we don't know for sure how this happened or who's behind it, but we shouldn't necessarily presume it was a state-sponsored attack, correct?
No, it's not always really.
Yeah.
There is, all sorts of actors in any kind of attack, really. There are nation-state sponsored actors which are kind of targeting crypto space, for example, in NPM. So we're kind of tracking Lazarus as one of those
Hmm.
financially motivated threat actors. But there's also,
North
people who
Korea,
are
yes,
just,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And there are also people who are, call them hobbyists doing that to kind of see what they can get away with. And there's also red teaming attacks as well being rampant there. So it's very hard to just look at a piece of code and say, oh, they did it.
Mhm.
Sometimes, only after doing additional threat intelligence work and, correlating infrastructures and so on, you get to a point to say, yes, this was definitely, nation state sponsor acted. But those attributions are rare, and sometimes they can be inaccurate.
Okay, so we have a short poll for our attendees. If you got a second, we can throw this up. We're looking to get a sense of kind of what's going on in your organization with regard to software supply chain security, and what measures your organization is taking. So this is, how well does your organization inventory and track third-party and open source software components and dependencies? And you can see the options there. We'll give you a minute or so to respond to see. Okay. So let's see. We have a comprehensive SBOM and automated SBOM, software bill of materials. That was nobody. We track components manually. It's 60%. We rely on vendors to manage this, about 20%, and we don't track software components at all, 20%. And we got about a quarter, 25% participation. Chris, Tomislav, thoughts on that?
Yeah. If you look at it, it kind of goes back to, the SBOM piece speaks for itself. But, again, this is a small sample set. But,
Yeah.
if you look at that between the manual tracking, not tracking at all, or simply just trusting the vendors, like that encompasses the remaining 100% of voting there. So, anyone who knows the open source ecosystem and how expansive it is in terms of versions, libraries, projects, like doing that in a manual fashion at any kind of scale in an ongoing, repeatable, kind of environment is incredibly difficult to do accurately, at least. And then trusting the vendors. Well, we just kind of enumerated why that might be a problem. And not tracking at all. Well, you're kind of just leaving yourself, hey, we're just
vulnerable.
Gonna go with it and see what happens here. So yeah, none of those are ideal. And I think that speaks to, my point earlier where organizations are aware of the challenges, but I think we have a lot of work still to do.
Yeah. Sort of if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach. But of course, just because it ain't broke doesn't mean it's not going to break or get broken for you. Okay, so moving on. Thanks. We got I think another one or two other poll questions coming. So stay tuned. Another big focus of this year's report, as our previous year's reports, was of course open source software risk and flaws in popular open source packages. We monitored NPM, Python Package Index, Ruby Gems, and others. And we saw definitely a continuation of flaws in vulnerabilities in popular NPM and Python packages. We did a survey actually of around 30 popular Python NPM packages, scanning them for, so these were widely used, many down, either thousands or millions of downloads a week, and many dependent applications. And what we found was definitely very concerning. That there are a lot of known and in many cases exploitable, and in some cases actively exploited vulnerabilities lurking out there in open source code, and widely used open source code. Tomislav, explain to me kind of why this is and what risk it poses for development organizations.
Well, the way I like to think about it is that it's never been harder to actually maintain proper software supply chain security hygiene, because you have this duality of the whole thing. One is there are vulnerabilities, and there are many more software security researchers nowadays than there ever were, and we're finding all these bugs, which is a good thing. And the natural response of a software developer is, well, I'm just always going to update to the latest version. Latest version should always be the most secure. they are going to patch all these things, and as they do this, my code is going to be secure. However, there are also software supply chain attacks. And just because a software package is popular doesn't mean that it can't get compromised. Going back to that, December, a few very important software packages were compromised, and the developers who have had unpinned dependencies, which is just use the latest version, so I mitigate the vulnerabilities, have inadvertently become compromised. So it is a trade-off between, kind of like pick your poison type of a thing.
Hmm.
And in my mind, handling vulnerabilities is unnecessarily evil because all code is gonna contain bugs, regardless of how much effort you put into it. A slip up is going to happen. Luckily, we find them, and then what we have to do is kind of triage them for importance. Just because it is a vulnerability doesn't mean your code is actually
Right.
using that part of the code, and
Right.
just because it's a critical thing doesn't mean it's critical the way you're using the software. And no graph is actually going to be able to kind of say how important something should be in your environment. And that is why people need to invest a little bit more into the whole process of analyzing, triaging, and assessing criticality. Now, just because we know doesn't mean we shouldn't patch, and just because it could be malicious doesn't mean it is. So we need to balance the two. That's kind of the way I'm thinking about it.
Chris, is this a structural issue with the way the open source ecosystem works, namely that it is still largely a volunteer effort around many of these packages? And, as with most volunteer things, you kind of get what you pay for. And, staying on top of these security vulnerabilities and patching them is a lot of work and effort and tends to fall back to just feature development and integrations and stuff like that. I mean,
Yeah,
is
I think
that why? Is that what's going on here?
yeah, it's a mix of all of those, to be honest with you. Like the kind of the voluntary, unpaid, non-compensated nature of it is going to create a situation where they may not be incentivized to move quickly and address bugs and vulnerabilities and things like that. And even though I forget the exact metrics, but the overwhelming majority of projects are maintained by one or sub 10, people, basically, even widely used ones in many cases.
Yeah.
And your report had a really great aspect around code rot, showing that just how many projects, libraries, and things like that haven't been updated in not just months but in years in some cases. And even if they've been updated, as we know, there's no assurance that the organization that's using it downstream is using the latest version. They may be using a vulnerable previous version or something like that that they haven't kind of upgraded to and patched and so on. That's aspect of it. And then there's also something to be said about there. Think he had just made this comment. There's no software that's infallible, that won't have vulnerabilities or flaws. And in some cases, it's a good thing. Like, we at least know that there's these vulnerabilities. How many more are there out there that haven't been identified yet, but kind of quote unquote 0 days, right? That are out there lurking in these projects, these libraries, these dependencies, but maybe just haven't been identified yet. And I think that's where we're going to see some interesting things start to evolve when we see people try to use Gen AI, LLM, AI more broadly to kind of use it for vulnerability identification, or even hopefully, maybe ideally, eventually, a vulnerability remediation, things like that. Not to drop the AI buzzword, but I do hope that it can help in that area in time. But again, knowing that there's these vulnerabilities, at least we know of them. There may be many more that we don't know of. And again, it goes back to his point as well. Like, just because it's a vulnerability, it doesn't mean it's necessarily reachable, exploitable, known to be exploited. Those kind of things too. So the data, it's interesting and it should be concerning. But again, you kind of got to take your own organizational context into play there.
Sure. And I should note these are averages. There were definitely some packages that had outsized numbers of vulnerabilities, including critical and high. And so actually, when you look at the median numbers for the packages, these numbers are a little bit lower. But the trend is really clear. And one package that we kind of dive into in the report is Torch Vision. This is a Python package that is very, very widely used. Hundreds of millions of downloads, and we look back over and also actively manage, unlike some of the packages we looked at. So 10 versions in the last year. But when you look back at the trend regarding the ability to address the vulnerabilities, including critical and high severity vulnerabilities, it's a pretty flat line. You see a little bit of a decrease, but not one that is sustained. And those critical and high vulnerability lines stay pretty steady. And again, this particular package very, very widely used. So what's the lesson here, Chris, in your mind, for development organizations?
It kind of goes back to some of the things we touched on, which is like that governance, that internal process, around vetting what you're using and understanding, like, maybe you're okay with this risk, but you should at least be aware of it. You should have a process to kind of mitigate it where appropriate. Have this level of visibility around what you're consuming, where it's coming from, any residual risks associated with it. I think just having those kind of foundational practices in place can go a long way. A lot of people, kind of just look at open source as inexhaustible, good that they can just consume with no consequence. And as we're seeing, that's not the case. There's a lot of things that need to be considered, and it's not just known vulnerabilities. Going back to the beginning of the conversation, the OpenSSF scorecard, and understanding how well it's maintained, by whom, how often, the bloat of the dependencies that are involved, all those kind of things come into play too. So just having those foundational practices, I think, can go a long way for organizations.
And Tomislav, I mean, you mentioned that, that you can't just look at a high level at these because, it really comes down to how you're using this particular open source package and what components, what elements of it you're using. Does that play out in practice, or is it the case that, developers who are in a hurry might just pull in all the entire package, regardless of whether they only need to use a small part of it? And do you see any change in developer practices where they're being more thoughtful about, kind of what components of an open source package they actually pull into their application and use?
Well, sadly, with most of these things, it's kind of all or nothing type of a deal, right? Like it is literally a package, and even if a small subset of it is actually vulnerable, you end up deploying all of it. And that's a risk you onboard your application. And it doesn't matter if you're not using it. I mean, if an attacker compromises the machine and a vulnerable piece of software is there, that vulnerability might get exploited to kind of pivot elsewhere as well. So it is extremely difficult to slim down the application just to the necessary parts because of the way they are kind of compiled and packaged today. You end up inheriting a lot of the risks that you might not necessarily be using. You can document all that risk even in the SBOM format. There's something called VEX, which lets you kind of annotate and say, under certain scenarios, these are exploitable, these are mitigated, all sorts of things. It is a lot of effort to actually do that. And developers should be doing that because the consumers will inevitably ask these questions already. Are you affected by this vulnerability? Is a very common question, and it's not part of a security questionnaire per se, but when there's a log4j type of vulnerability, all sorts of emails start flying out, and you will need to do vulnerability triage, whether you like it or not, unfortunately.
Right. And I think one of the things, one of the other conclusions of our report, and I should remind you, we've got a few minutes left. We are interested in your questions, so if you have questions that you're interested in having answered, throw them into the Q&A portal, and we will deal with them. We'll answer them. But one of the clear discoveries or clear realizations in the last year was that even just talking about vulnerabilities in and of itself is not addressing your full risk as a development organization or even as an end user organization. One of the things we saw was a real kind of decrease in the accuracy of the NVD, National Vulnerability Database, which was a resource issue with them just not being able to process the quantity of vulnerabilities they were being given. And this is a graphic that illustrates that. One of the recommendations from our report is, CVEs and vulnerabilities, known identified vulnerabilities, cannot be the sole focus of your application security or your secure development process. Yeah, Chris, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. And this graphic basically shows the difference between CVEs, assigned CVEs, and those that have been basically analyzed and enriched by the on NVD, and a clear kind of split there.
Yeah, I mean, I had wrote a pretty comprehensive piece discussing this. I think it was started in February of last year, and about 4 months or so. I forget the exact time frame that the NVD kind of outright, I don't want to say collapsed, but just quit functioning, quit enriching CVEs that were coming into the NVD due to contractual issues and support from the workforce that supports NIST as a federal agency, their contractor support staff, things like that. And it, ironically enough, a researcher, I forget his name, but just last week shared something on LinkedIn showing that, hey, there seems to be something going on again, because we have many CVEs that are again now going unenriched or unanalyzed, with this contextual type information that we're looking for. And so I don't really know what's going on there, but NIST never has recovered from that backlog of last year. They still have thousands of CVEs that are still sitting in this awaiting to be analyzed, kind of status. Yeah. And that's just the NVD, right? You have OSV, you have OSS Index, you have GitHub security advisories. Like, to make sense of all these vulnerability databases as a single organization with a limited team and things like that is incredibly intimidating. And again, that's even to the point of what we've been discussing, where that's just known vulnerabilities. That's not all the other things that we've been talking about. So I definitely
tampering, malware, right.
Yeah, there may not be an identifier assigned to it. It's not tracked in a database like the NVD. There's many other things that you need to be concerned about beyond just known vulnerabilities. And even if that is just your focus, you're likely missing a lot due to challenges with the NVD, just to name one reason.
Yeah. Tomislav, thoughts on how folks should be thinking about CVEs and their relationship to their overall risk.
It's a part of it, yes. And as we were just saying, not everything which is important is also a CVE. And just speaking about malicious packages in particular, very few of them actually have a CVE assigned. So if your strategy of defending yourself against malicious packages relies on NVD or CVE information, there's a huge visibility gap. So only the most popular ones actually get a CVE assigned, and not because they are a vulnerability, it's because they are a malicious exposure. That's the E part of the CVE. So really, these security programs need to be enhanced. OSV, for example, has both the vulnerability data and malware data as well. It is in a common format, so you can kind of interchange between the two. But again, not all of the malicious packages are even in there. So that is a very concerning type of a thing. How do you exchange information about actual software risk? Yeah.
Right. And obviously some of the interesting stuff that's going on at the federal level right now does raise questions about what is to come and whether the resources will be there. As Chris, as you said, there are real questions about that. Okay, there is a question in the chat, not the Q&A. Teams struggle with the context to prioritize vulnerabilities effectively. How many of those high, low, or exploit risk and public exploits available? Also, the problem to determine if these are under DevOps control due to indirect dependencies. So, yeah, I mean, it's sort of the question about how should we interpret these high risk, critical risk vulnerabilities? Tomislav, that is the elephant in the living room with all of these assessments. What would you recommend? What would your advice be?
Well, the way we do it really is to look at the actionable threat intelligence to see if there are any known malware exploiting it. Is CISA, advocating for this thing to be patched, right? Those are the primary data points to make a decision. That kind of cuts down a lot of the noise. If you use that information, it's a good starting point. There's also publicly available and free resources like EBSS, which kind of estimates whether or not vulnerability could be exploited as well. That is also a good starting point. And ultimately, there are many constituencies in the software development process. So you can't really just say, oh, it's a DevOps problem. It isn't. Developers need to be involved because they know the context of the application. Patching or mitigating vulnerabilities is a lot more than just updating a dependency. Sometimes you actually need to patch the code to be able to backport like a fix or something like that.
Okay. So just wrapping up here, what are the lessons going ahead for development organizations? As we say in our report, supply chain risk is changing. You need to be prepared. Tomislav and Chris, just maybe some closing thoughts on what you would recommend, keeping the findings of this report in mind. Chris, start with you.
From my end, I would touch on, kind of pick up where he left off, and to the, comment in the chat there is focusing on not just, base CVSS scores in terms of criticality, but known exploitation probability from sources like EPSS, reachability, right? If it's used, if the function's called within the code or it's used in a runtime environment. And again, keep an eye on those commercial binaries, the risk coming from the commercial software vendors. They're much like any other organization, even your security vendors, are an organization with competing constraints and incentives and things like that. So I think we covered a lot of ground, and I hope that equips people to kind of think about this from a lot of different perspectives.
Absolutely. Tomislav, thoughts?
I just plug our report. It's a pretty good read. There are many interesting findings in there. There are nice timelines of events and so on and so forth. If you haven't given it a read, please consider doing so. The team spent quite a lot of effort to kind of research and compile this data.
Okay, Chris has to drop. He's got another thing to jump into. Just Tomislav, if you got a second, I mean, I think some of the trends that we're watching going into 2025, obviously, is the artificial intelligence and its impact. And I think one of the things that we've shown clearly in our research is AI and ML applications and infrastructure are absolutely a target for malicious actors, and there needs to be awareness there about that. Maybe just a quick summary of kind of what you've seen in the last year on that front.
Well, the one I found interesting was this model called BATSeek, which is kind of like a backdoored version of DeepSeek. DeepSeek was in the news for all sorts of reasons. But there's a researcher who created a backdoor version of it, which, when prompted incorrectly, creates unsafe code that actually has backdoors in it.
Right.
So that is another area of risk that people need to be aware of. And I think it's just starting to become interesting for the attackers to think about how they can exploit models and how they can trick developers to introduce even more uncertainty into the code they're writing.
Absolutely. Okay. So thank you so much, Tomislav, for joining us, and obviously Chris, for the attendees. Things to keep in mind going forward. We've got some more webinars here for you that you might be interested in. On April 9th, we've got one on securing your virtual machines. Before you deploy that virtual machine disk image, you know what's inside it. On April 9th, we're going to talk about early detection of tampered or malicious virtual machines and how you can use that to stop threats before they enter your environment. And then the day after, April 10th, we've got an interesting webinar coming up, EU regulatory compliance and software supply chain security. So CRA, NIS2, DORA, those are on your radar, or you want to get ahead of kind of what's coming down the road in the EU, check it out on April 10th. You can go to our webpage and pre-register for those events as well. I want to thank everybody who's here, and just keep in mind, if you haven't checked it out, go to secure.software. This is the Spectra Assure community, and we've got a free service for you to assess the security of open source packages you may be using or interested in using, and you can access some of our reports for free there, show you the security risks that might lurk in those. So check that out. And thanks everybody for joining us. We are really glad to have had you. And if you're interested in following up with Chris, check out his site, resilientcyber.io. Chris Hughes is absolutely a huge presence in the cybersecurity industry. Got some really great insights, as you saw today. So check that out as well. But thanks, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you on one of our future webinars. And it's been a pleasure. And please download our report when you get a chance. Thank you.
Thank you.